I am not a historian, but neither are you. So, how about we, the people, learn this stuff together? Welcome to US 101. For the first couple episodes for Black History Month, we've been mostly talking about the dudes. So, how about for the rest of Black History Month, we talk all about the ladies. So in today's episode, guys, we're going to be talking about Ida B. Wells, that's her right there, and her crusade against lynching in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Because you have to remember something, guys. To celebrate Black History Month doesn't mean just simply remembering and celebrating all the triumphs that African Americans have accomplished, but remembering all of the tragedies that they've had to suffer. While slavery is a deep and terrible scar that sits right on the face of the United States, guys, the things that were done to African Americans after the Civil War and their subsequent freeing from bondage were just as horrific. Take lynching, for example. And if you guys don't know what lynching is, or if you've never heard the term lynch mob, I would recommend that you Google it. But be mindful that the images that you will find will be upsetting and maddening. During the Reconstruction era and the Jim Crow era, which followed, the number of African Americans that were lynched during this time, I don't really think that there is a specific number, because that number is so incredibly high, it's been almost impossible for historians to keep track. And lynching occurred for a number of reasons, guys. Basically, what would happen is that white mobs would go out and find an African American and accuse them of a crime. Most of the time, there was no evidence being presented, and their accusations were unfounded. But they would go out and get that African American, and they would just murder him. A lot of times for no really good reason. And did anybody ever stop these lynch mobs from committing these horrific acts? Oftentimes, no. And one of these lynchings occurred in Memphis, Tennessee in March of 1892. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Will Stewart, all three men African American, were running a grocery store in Memphis, and it was called the People's Grocery. And the store was doing quite well. It was bringing in a lot of business. They were successful businessmen. Problem is that the People's Grocery was in the same neighborhood as a white-owned grocery store, and the white owners of the grocery store and the white people that went to that grocery store weren't all that happy that the black grocery store was doing well. Tension begins to rise between the People's Grocery and the white-owned grocery store, and threats of violence are being hurled at the three men that run the People's Grocery, so naturally they start arming themselves because they feel like they're going to have to defend themselves at one point. The three men were later told that a mob was going to be coming to their grocery store to destroy the store. And at one point, a group of deputies make their way to the store because they were serving a warrant based, again, on unfounded charges. But the men in the store did not know that these men were deputies, so they started firing at these men. Needless to say, Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were jailed for firing at officers of the law. But only 3 days later, a group of 75 white people broke into the jail, took the three men from the jail, took them outside, and shot them to death. And let us remember that the reason that these three men were murdered was because they just happened to be three black men that were running a successful grocery store near a white-owned grocery store. If you are pissed off after hearing that story, I completely understand. And news of this lynching would eventually be heard by the focus of our episode for today, Ida B. Wells. Now, before we get into her anti-lynching crusade, let me give you just a little bit of background about her so that you get a full picture of who this person is. Ida B. Wells was born on July 16, 1862 in Mississippi. And yes, she was born into slavery. Both of her parents were slaves. But following the Civil War, her parents were freed, and they threw themselves into Reconstruction era politics. And Ida did go to school to receive a formal education, but she had to put that education on hold at the age of 16 when both of her parents and one of her younger brothers died of yellow fever. So now she had to be in charge of running the family. So she had to take care of her sister, her other brothers, and so she ended up getting a job as a teacher. She became an educator herself. Eventually, Ida would move her siblings from Mississippi to Memphis, Tennessee, where she would continue to become a teacher. But it's around this point in 1884 when Ida B. Wells makes the transition from teacher to activist. In 1884, she boarded a streetcar with a first-class ticket, meaning that she could sit in the first-class car in the streetcar. But then when the conductor approached her, said to her, "Ma'am, you cannot sit here. You have to sit in the African-American car." She said, "Why? I have a first-class ticket. I have just as much right to sit here as anybody else does." They did not take too kindly to her mouth, so the conductor and a couple other guys threw her off of the streetcar. She sued the company that ran the streetcar, and she did win in local court. She did win her case, but then later the company appealed the ruling, and the ruling was overturned in federal court. Now, in addition to suing the company, Ida B. Wells went ahead and wrote about her experience in a local newspaper, and people started to take notice of her and her writing and her story. That story would get her a little bit of exposure, and it would eventually lead to her getting a job as a writer at a Memphis-based newspaper called the Free Speech and Headlight, which was run by a Reverend Nightingale. And the purpose of the paper was to run anti-segregation articles and editorials. And it is at this point that Wells and the People's Grocery lynching would meet head to head, because it turns out that the three men from the People's Grocery that were lynched, Ida B. Wells knew them personally. So following their deaths, Wells wrote in the Free Speech that African Americans should just go ahead and leave Memphis, Tennessee, because if it was this easy for African Americans to lose their lives over something as stupid as that, what was the point of even staying there anymore? The white mob could help itself to ammunition without pay, but the order is rigidly enforced against the selling of guns to Negroes. There is therefore only one thing left to do: save our money and leave a town which will neither protect our lives and property, nor give us a fair trial in the courts, but takes us out and murders us in cold blood when accused by white persons. And it turns out that a lot of people would listen to that article, because following its publishing, a lot of African Americans up and left Memphis, Tennessee. They said, this, we're not staying here. I'm not trying to die in these streets. And then the African Americans that remained in Memphis would go ahead and try to organize boycotts against white-run businesses. And Wells, now seeing the power of the pen, continued to write. In fact, later on, she would release a pamphlet called Southern Horrors, in which she said that the relationships, I'm talking the sexual relationships, romantic relationships that happened between black men and white women, were actually mutual, and white women were not like these lustful objects that black men wanted to prey on. It was an agreed upon thing. And how do you think the white community of Memphis, Tennessee responded to these written statements? Do you think they said, you know what? Maybe she's got a point. You know, she might be onto something. I wish I could tell you that was the case, but no. Here's what they did instead. Coming to an understanding would have been too difficult. So they made the next logical choice. They formed a mob, went to the Free Speech, went to the newspaper that Ida B. Wells wrote for, and proceeded to burn it down. Over the next few years, she would become an investigative journalist and bring to light the lynchings that were happening, not just in the southern part of the United States, but throughout the United States, in northern states as well. In 1895, after a few years of research, investigating, collecting data, Ida B. Wells would pretty much shock the nation with a book that she would release called Red Record, which listed all of the lynchings that had occurred throughout the United States since the Emancipation Proclamation was made by Abraham Lincoln in 1863. And because of her investigation, she was able to keep meticulous notes on all the data that she had compiled. And as a matter of fact, if you guys want to read Red Record for yourself, I recommend you do so. Link is down below in the description box. I recommend you check out chapters 2 and 9, because in those chapters, Wells breaks down the number of African Americans that were lynched, why they were lynched, what crimes they had committed, what year they were lynched, and what states they were lynched in. And some of these crimes that African Americans were lynched for, were hung for, are just mind-boggling. One guy was lynched because he wrote a letter to a white woman. Another guy was lynched because he asked a white woman to marry him. And she also said, I believe at one point, a group of African Americans were lynched because they were, quote, saucy. I don't know what that means. I imagine it like they had like an attitude problem with somebody, and so someone decided that these people should die. Additionally, her investigation also revealed that sometimes African Americans were lynched for no reason at all. It just happened to them. If you guys read this thing, I'm telling you, your jaw will literally drop off of your face onto the floor. And Wells didn't just crusade against lynching in print. She went ahead and toured around the United States and other parts of the world and spoke out against lynching. In fact, when she moved from Memphis to Chicago in the 1890s because the threats on her life down south were getting too unbearable, she continued to write. She continued to speak out. She continued to get involved in politics. She got involved in Illinois local politics. And then on top of everything else that Ida B. Wells was doing, in 1909, guys, she teamed up with a few other notable African Americans and some other people like W.e.b. Du Bois, and would form a group that's still in existence today. It's called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. You also know it as the NAACP. Now, did Ida B. Wells' investigative journalism put a stop to lynching? I wish I could say yes, but unfortunately, no, it did not put a stop to lynching. It did bring a few bills to Congress, some anti-lynching bills that tried to pass, but unfortunately those were struck down. But what Wells did do is inform the public. Her book, like Red Record, her pamphlets, would go on to shed light on the horrors of lynching that was happening in the United States, and would pretty much open the eyes of many Americans and let them know, hey, this is happening. And that, my friends, is it for this episode of US 101. If you are feeling upset, if you are feeling sickened by this episode and by everything that you heard in this episode, I don't blame you. When I was doing the research for this, I had to stop reading Red Record a couple times because I couldn't get through certain parts, because it's disturbing to read, man. It's not a fun read. As always, guys, I can't thank you enough for watching these episodes, for sharing them, for liking them, for leaving comments in the comment section below. I love the dialogue that started up by a lot of these episodes, and I love chatting with you guys. You can follow US 101 on Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, patreon.com/US 101 if you want to pledge some money to the show, and in return you get some really cool rewards, really cool prizes. You can also go ahead and buy some US 101 merch. We have pint glasses available at classicetching.com. That link is down below in the description box. Guys, I will see you next Tuesday for an all new episode of US 101. Until then, I am all done. Yeah, go ahead and read Red Record for yourself. If it's a tough read and you can't get through it, I completely understand, but yeah, read it. Whew.